40,000 years ago, someone sat in a cave in southern Germany, picked up a tiny ivory mammoth figurine that fit in the palm of their hand, and carved rows of crosses and dots into it. Not randomly, not decoratively, in a pattern that, when you run it through modern information theory analysis, is statistically indistinguishable from the earliest known proto-writing tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. The ones we've always called the beginning of writing. A study just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences ran the numbers on over 3,000 of these geometric signs carved into 260 Ice Age objects. And the results made the lead researcher go back and recheck his own data multiple times because he could not believe what he was seeing. So what exactly did they find? And what does it mean for the story we tell ourselves about when humans started recording information? Let me set the stage. The standard textbook version goes something like this. Writing was invented about 5,400 years ago in Mesopotamia. Sumerian scribes pressed reeds into wet clay to track grain shipments and cattle counts. Before that, nothing. Just grunting cave people with big sticks. That is the story most of us learned. Now, everyone in archaeology already knew that was oversimplified. We have evidence of symbolic behavior going back a long time. Ochre engravings from South Africa, 77,000 years old. Shell beads from Morocco, 142,000 years old. There is even a zigzag scratched onto a mussel shell in Java, attributed to Homo erectus, roughly 500,000 years ago. So we knew ancient humans could make marks. The question was always whether those marks were just art, just decoration, just someone being creative, or whether they carried actual structured information. That distinction matters enormously, because decoration is personal expression. Structured information is communication technology, and that is exactly the gap this new study tries to bridge. Not by guessing what the marks mean, not by claiming they found ancient sentences or words, but by asking a much more precise question. If you treat these carved sequences purely as data, just strings of symbols, and you measure their statistical properties the same way a linguist would measure a text, what do you get? The researchers are Christian Bentz, a linguist at Saarland University, and Ewa Dutkiewicz, an archaeologist at the Museum for Pre- and Early History in Berlin. Dutkiewicz spent years doing something that sounds simple but is incredibly painstaking. She went through every single artifact under a microscope and cataloged each individual mark. She identified 22 distinct sign types: V-shaped notches, single lines, crosses, dots, stars, zigzags, grids. And she mapped each one to a digital character, essentially turning 40,000-year-old carvings into something a computer could analyze. That step alone is a major contribution, because before this, nobody had digitized these sign sequences at this scale. The artifacts themselves come from 4 caves in the Swabian, Jura region of southwestern Germany: Vogelherde, Geissenklostele, Hohlefels, Hohlenstein Stadel. If those names sound familiar, it is because these are some of the most famous archaeological sites on the planet. Hohlenstein Stadel gave us the Lion Man, that incredible 31-centimeter tall sculpture of a human body with a lion head carved from mammoth ivory, estimated to have taken over 400 hours to make. These were not simple people. These were people who allocated hundreds of hours of labor to create a single symbolic object. And that Lion Man, by the way, has regularly spaced notches carved along one arm, marks that for decades were dismissed as decorative. So Bentz takes all of Dutkiewicz's digitized sequences and runs them through a battery of quantitative tests. Type-token ratio, which measures how many different sign types appear relative to the total length. Shannon entropy, which captures how diverse or predictable the sign choices are. Entropy rate, which looks at how compressible the sequences are based on recurring patterns. And repetition rate, which tracks how often you get the same sign repeated back to back. Cross, 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 line, line, line. Then comes the comparison that makes this study different from everything before it. He compares the Ice Age sequences against 2 benchmarks. First, 89 modern writing systems from 16 different scripts, everything from English to Chinese to Arabic. Second, the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, the ones from around 3500 BCE that we consider humanity's first attempt at written records. And the result? And the EU, when you plot all of this in a statistical space, The Aurignacian sign sequences and the Uruk proto-cuneiform tablets sit right on top of each other. They overlap completely. Meanwhile, modern writing systems cluster far away in a totally different region. Machine learning classifiers could separate Ice Age signs from modern writing with near-perfect accuracy. But when asked to tell apart Ice Age signs from proto-cuneiform, they performed no better than random guessing. The algorithms literally could not tell the difference. Now, let me be very clear about what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean these Ice Age people were writing. It does not mean they had language encoded in symbols. Modern writing has high entropy and low repetition because it encodes the complexity of spoken language, grammar, syntax, all of it. These Ice Age sequences have the opposite profile: low entropy, high repetition, cross, 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 dot, dot, dot. That pattern is not language, but it is exactly what you see in early accounting and record-keeping systems. Think tallies, think inventories, think categorization marks. Short, structured, repetitive entries that record quantities or categories rather than sentences. So the claim is not that writing is 40,000 years older than we thought. The claim is that structured information encoding, the human ability to create a conventional system of marks that carry specific meaning and can be read by others who share the convention, that capacity is at least 40,000 years old. And that is a fundamentally different story about human cognition than the one where Sumerian accountants just invented it one day because they had too much grain to count. But the data gets more interesting when you zoom in. The researchers found that not all objects carried the same density of information. Figurines, the carved animals, and human-animal hybrids carried about 15% higher information density than tools. Tools ran about 10% higher than flutes, and flutes ran about 15% higher than personal ornaments like beads. That hierarchy is not random. It suggests that these people were deliberately choosing which objects got the densest, most complex markings, as if certain categories of objects were better vehicles for whatever information was being recorded. And then there is the pattern that I think is the most fascinating detail in the entire paper. Specific signs were reserved for specific subjects. Dots appeared on human figures and on depictions of felines. Crosses appeared on mammoths and horses, but crosses never appeared on human figures. Never. Across thousands of years and multiple cave sites, that rule held. Whatever crosses meant, they were not applied to humans. That is not decoration. Decoration does not follow prohibitions across millennia and across communities separated by valleys and generations. That is a rule, a shared convention, something that was taught and transmitted. Think about what that implies. 40,000 years ago, there was a community of people, probably multiple communities across this region of Germany, who all agreed that certain marks go on certain things and not on others. They maintained that agreement for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of cultural stability in a symbolic system. For reference, the entire span of recorded human history, from the first cuneiform to right now, is about 5,400 years. This Ice Age system lasted almost twice that long, and it did not drift. The statistical properties of the signs show no significant change over that entire period, and no significant variation between cave sites. Let me give you one specific artifact that captures all of this. The Adorant plaquette from Geysen Claustral Cave, about 38,000 years old. It is a small ivory plate. On one side, a carved figure of a lion-human hybrid. On the other side, rows of notches and dots, 12 to 13 notches in a row. Dutkiewicz points out that 12 to 13 is consistent with the number of lunar months. Now, the researchers are very careful not to claim that this is a lunar calendar. They deliberately chose not to interpret meaning, and that restraint is actually one of the strongest things about the paper. But the consistency of that number is hard to ignore. And this is where I want to talk about the broader context, because this study did not come out of nowhere. Back in 1972, a journalist turned self-taught scholar named Alexander Marshak published a book called The Roots of Civilization. He argued that Upper Paleolithic bone markings were lunar notations, calendars tracking the passage of time. His colleagues ripped him apart. Too speculative, they said. You are seeing patterns that are not there. But decades later, scanning electron microscopy confirmed that many of those marks were indeed structured, made with different tools at different times, not just idle scratching. Then in 2016, Genevieve von Petzinger published her finding that only 32 geometric sign types recur consistently across nearly 400 cave sites spanning all of Europe in 40,000 plus years. 32 signs. That is a small, finite set. Think about that. If these were random doodles, you would expect far more variety. A limited, recurring vocabulary implies selection from a culturally agreed-upon set. And in 2023, Ben Bacon, a furniture conservator from London with no formal archaeological training, published a paper arguing that dots, lines, and Y-shaped marks in cave paintings were a lunar calendar tracking animal mating and birthing seasons. That paper was celebrated, but also formally challenged, with critics identifying misidentified signs at multiple sites. So what makes Bentz and Dutkiewicz different? What makes their approach stronger? They deliberately refuse to interpret meaning. They do not claim calendars or language or any specific content. They only measure structure. And that methodological restraint is precisely what has drawn praise from independent experts. Genevieve von Petzinger herself called the computational approach excellent, saying the study shows that the way marks are being used has a configuration that closely matches proto-cuneiform, pointing to the transmission of complex ideas. Robert Kentridge, a psychologist at Durham University, praised the decision not to assign meaning as the more sensible approach. And he pushed back on the caveman stereotype, saying he is pretty sure that if we dressed these people in jeans and a t-shirt, they would be just like us. Now let me be honest about the weaknesses because every study has them, and this one is no exception. First, the coding reliability. When two researchers independently categorize these 40,000-year-old marks, they agree about 91 to 94% of the time on the raw classification. That sounds good. But a more rigorous statistical measure called Cohen's kappa gives values between 0.29 and 0.44. That is modest. It means there is genuine difficulty in deciding where one sign type ends and another begins on heavily weathered ivory. Different coding decisions could shift the statistical distributions. Second, and this is the big one, statistical similarity does not prove functional similarity. Two systems can have the exact same entropy profile while encoding entirely different things, or nothing at all. A sequence of random marks that happens to follow certain constraints could mimic the statistical fingerprint of meaningful notation. The authors acknowledge this explicitly. They call it a necessary but not sufficient condition for functional equivalence. That is honest, but it also means the skeptics have a real foothold. There is a computational linguist named Richard Sproat who has spent years arguing that statistical measures alone cannot reliably distinguish writing systems from non-linguistic symbol systems. His critique has been applied to the Indus Valley script debate, and it applies here too. If your statistical tools cannot tell the difference between a meaningful information system and a sufficiently constrained decorative tradition, then what exactly have you proven? Third, the system never evolved. Proto-cuneiform became full Sumerian writing within about 1,000 years. The Aurignacian system stayed the same for 10,000 years and then just disappeared. It left no descendants. No later system built on it. That absence of development is both fascinating and, from a skeptic's perspective, potentially damning. If this was truly a functional information system, why did it never get more complex? One answer is that small mobile hunter-gatherer bands simply did not face the administrative pressures that drove Mesopotamian cities to develop full writing. They did not need to track tax receipts for 10,000 people. Their system did what they needed it to do, and it did it well enough for 10 millennia. Fourth, the data comes from one cluster of caves in southwestern Germany. The authors acknowledge that other important regions, the Dordogne in France, sites in Belgium, have not been analyzed this way yet. They say they have only scratched the surface. Their project, funded by a €1.5 million grant from the European Research Council, is ongoing. There are thousands of artifacts in museums across Europe with sign sequences that nobody has digitized or analyzed computationally. So where does this leave us? The gap between these structured symbols and Mesopotamian proto-cuneiform spans roughly 37,000 years. To put that in perspective, that gap is 12 times longer than the entire span from cuneiform to the present day. Everything we call civilization, agriculture, cities, empires, the Industrial Revolution, the Internet, all of it fits into the most recent sliver of human symbol use. These marks are 30,000 years older than farming, 37,500 years older than the Great Pyramid. And there is something genuinely haunting about the fact that this system just ended. Unlike proto-cuneiform, which evolved into the full Sumerian script within a millennium, the Aurignacian system maintained itself for 10,000 years and then vanished without a trace. An entire tradition of structured information practiced across communities for twice the length of recorded history, simply gone. Not because it failed, maybe because the world changed. The Ice Age shifted, populations moved, and the social structures that maintain those conventions dissolved. That is not just an archaeological curiosity. That is a lesson about knowledge itself. Innovation is not inevitable. Complex systems of shared meaning can exist for staggering periods of time and still disappear completely, leaving behind only tiny carved objects in German museum drawers that we spent 40,000 years misreading as decoration. The Australian Aboriginal art tradition is an interesting parallel. Aboriginal Australians maintain the world's oldest continuous art tradition, using concentric circles, U-shapes, animal tracks, and dots in a symbolic vocabulary that has persisted for at least 28,000 years. Like the Aurignacian signs, these symbols were culturally transmitted and meaningful without being writing. It proves that sophisticated visual information systems can endure across deep time without ever evolving into phonetic script. So maybe the question is not when was writing invented? Maybe the question is why we keep drawing this hard line between real writing and everything that came before it, as if the only thing that counts is when somebody figured out how to spell words. These Ice Age people had a system. It was structured, it was shared, it was maintained across 10,000 years. It encoded something that mattered enough to carve into the most precious objects they possessed. We just cannot read it. And honestly, we may never be able to. There is no Rosetta Stone for the Aurignacian, no descendant system to serve as a key. The 12 to 13 notches on the adorant plaquette might track lunar months. The crosses on mammoths might mark hunting categories. But those are educated guesses. What the data actually proves is that whatever these signs meant, they meant something. Consistently, deliberately, across communities, for millennia. A small ivory mammoth, carved by someone who hunted real mammoths, held in the same hand that carved rows of crosses and dots into its surface, not because it looked nice, but because those marks carried information. That object is sitting in a museum right now. It has been there for decades, and we are only just beginning to understand what it actually is. Not art, not decoration. One of the oldest pieces of evidence that our species thinks in systems, that we have been encoding, sharing, and preserving information for far, far longer than anyone assumed. 5,000 years of writing is what we celebrate. 40,000 years of structured symbols is what we almost missed. If you want more of the latest science that rewrites what we thought we knew, there is always something new. And sometimes the older it is, the more it changes